When Rolling Stone magazine released their 100 Greatest Guitarists list on a grey November morning, the name missing from its pages would ignite a firestorm that nobody could have predicted. Music journalists refreshed their screens repeatedly, certain it was a digital error, while veteran rock critics sat in stunned silence at their desks. The architect of Stairway to Heaven, the man who made a guitar weep and thunder with equal mastery, had been erased from history by the very publication that once crowned him a god. Within hours, social media erupted into chaos as fans dissected every entry, their disbelief transforming into righteous fury. Legendary session musicians cancelled interviews with the magazine, their publicists delivering terse statements about editorial integrity. Record store owners in London, Los Angeles, and Sydney reported customers demanding explanations, as if they somehow held answers to this incomprehensible decision. The omission felt personal, like watching someone deny the existence of the sun. Music forums crashed under the weight of traffic as thousands debated whether this was calculated controversy or catastrophic oversight. Veteran roadies who had worked Zeppelin tours shared stories of witnessing Page's genius firsthand, their voices trembling with emotion. Guitar teachers worldwide faced classrooms full of confused students, asking if everything they had learned was suddenly meaningless. The Junbo continued spreading, reaching every corner where 6 strings had ever been electrified. Rolling Stone's offices went dark, phones unplugged, as the magnitude of their decision became devastatingly clear to everyone except those who made it. The fluorescent lights of Yamamoto Music Shop hummed softly as Kenji Tanaka scrolled through the controversial list on his phone, his calloused fingers trembling with disbelief. At 23, he had spent 7 years mastering every Page solo, every intricate hammer-on and pull-off, every sonic revolution the master had birthed. His battered Les Paul leaned against the wall, its worn fretboard a testament to countless hours dissecting Since I've Been Loving You, until his fingers bled. This erasure felt like denying gravity itself. Without planning or rehearsing, Kenji grabbed his guitar and positioned his phone on a stack of amplifiers, his heart pounding with purpose. The opening notes of Stairway to Heaven emerged tentatively at first, then swelled with defiant beauty as tears streamed down his face. He played not for perfection, but for truth, channeling every ounce of rage and reverence into those sacred strings. Behind him, vintage posters of Led Zeppelin watched like silent witnesses to this spontaneous rebellion. This is for the man who taught us that 6 strings could paint universes. Kenji spoke breathlessly into the camera, his English halting but fierce. He uploaded the video with shaking hands, titled simply, "Rolling Stone Forgot, But We Never Will." Within minutes, a music teacher in Barcelona shared it, then a session player in Nashville, then a grandmother in Manchester who had seen Zeppelin at Nebworth. The counter climbed exponentially, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, as the world remembered what corporate amnesia tried erasing. By dawn, Kenji's phone exploded with notifications from every continent, musicians posting their own tributes in solidarity. The revolution had begun in a tiny Tokyo shop, proving that legacy lives not in magazine pages, but in the hands of those who refuse to let greatness be forgotten. The afternoon light filtered through Eric Clapton's Surrey estate as he sat before a camera, his weathered hands resting on a vintage Telecaster. "People ask, who taught me to make the guitar weep?" he began, his voice thick with emotion, and the answer has always been Jimmy Page. He recounted a forgotten night in 1969 when Page showed him a revolutionary bending technique backstage at the Fillmore, transforming how Clapton approached every solo afterward. The video posted within hours, shattering the industry's silence. Brian May followed from his London studio, surrounded by walls of homemade amplifiers and Red Special replicas. He described attending a Yardbirds concert as a teenage physics student, witnessing Page conjure orchestral textures from pure electricity and feedback. He didn't just play notes, he architected cathedrals of sound, May explained, his eyes glistening behind wire-rimmed glasses. That single performance redirected his entire destiny, proving guitars could achieve what symphonies only dreamed. Jeff Beck's response came raw and unscripted from his workshop, grease still on his hands from restoring vintage cars. Jimmy explored territories the rest of us were too frightened to enter, he admitted with characteristic bluntness, explaining how Page's session work in the mid-60s established the sonic vocabulary modern rock still speaks. He played a blistering phrase, then stopped abruptly. That's his language. We're all just learning his dialect. Within 48 hours, testimonials flooded in. Joe Perry, Slash, The Edge, each sharing intimate stories of Page's invisible influence. The collective testimony formed an undeniable monument, built not from marble, but from gratitude and truth. The tape arrived at Abbey Road Studios in an unmarked envelope, postmarked 1968, its edges yellowed with decades of obscurity. Inside, engineer Glyn Johns discovered what historians would call the Rosetta Stone of modern rock. A 4-hour session capturing Page experimenting alone, his guitar plugged directly into consciousness itself. The recording quality was primitive, yet every revolutionary technique that would define the next 50 years lived in those magnetic grooves, raw and unfiltered. Johns played the tape for a gathering of session musicians and archivists, their faces transforming as Page's younger voice narrated his experiments between takes. If you reverse the delay and push the feedback until it screams, you create dimension, the 24-year-old explained, then demonstrated the technique that wouldn't appear on records until years later. His fingers explored harmonic territories without maps, inventing the violin bow's application to electric strings, crafting the modal scales that countless metal bands would worship as gospel. The room sat in reverent silence as Page dissected his approach to dynamics, building tension through whispered notes before volcanic eruptions of distortion. He spoke of guitars as storytelling instruments, capable of expressing what words abandoned, his philosophy already fully formed, while his contemporaries still chased simple blues patterns. Every innovation emerged not from accident, but architectural vision, each sound carefully constructed then deconstructed for deeper understanding. When the final reel finished, Johns looked at the assembled witnesses with tears streaming. He built the entire cathedral, while others were still mixing mortar. He whispered, the tape's existence now irrefutable proof that Page didn't follow rock's evolution. He authored its vocabulary, alone in a London basement, before the world was ready to listen. The video counter climbed like a fever dream. 10 million, 20 million, 40 million views in 72 hours. Kenji's trembling hands performing that sacred solo had become a rallying cry, musicians worldwide answering his call with their own instruments raised like torches against darkness. From basement studios in Sao Paulo to rooftop sessions in Mumbai, guitarists filmed themselves playing Page's most transcendent passages, each video a sworn testimony that genius cannot be erased by editorial negligence. In a Nashville dive bar, 3 session players live-streamed themselves dissecting the intricate fingerwork of Achilles' Last Stand, their commentary reaching 2 million listeners who'd never understood the mathematical precision behind Page's apparent chaos. A 17-year-old in Lagos posted her rendition of Kashmir, her acoustic guitar crying out the riff's Middle Eastern scales, while her voice proclaimed, "Legends don't disappear because magazines forget them." The hashtag spread like wildfire. Through digital veins, connecting generations who understood that Page's influence wasn't opinion, it was oxygen in rock's atmosphere. By the 5th day, 80 countries had contributed their voices to this spontaneous uprising. Classical violinists demonstrated his bowing techniques. Producers revealed how his layering philosophy built their entire careers. Teachers showed students the Page method of controlled feedback as fundamental curriculum. The movement transcended mere protest, becoming a masterclass in legacy, proof that true revolution doesn't require permission from gatekeepers. Kenji watched his phone explode with notifications, tears streaming as Eric Clapton himself shared the Tokyo video with a single comment: "The student has honored the master perfectly." The mailroom at Rolling Stone's Manhattan headquarters had never seen anything like it. Canvas postal bags lined the corridors 3 deep, each bulging with handwritten letters that kept arriving by the thousands, testimonials, protests, histories written in ink that wouldn't be ignored. Maria, the senior mail clerk, found herself crying as she opened envelope after envelope, reading stories of how a guitarist's genius had literally saved lives, resurrected dying musical traditions, opened doors that industry had welded shut. Then came the letter that changed everything, weathered paper, shaking. Cursive from a 90-year-old bluesman named Luther Washington, postmarked from Clarksdale, Mississippi. He wrote of 1967, when his recordings were being destroyed by a bankrupt label, how a young British session guitarist named Page heard the tapes and spent his own money to preserve them, remaster them, ensure Luther's Delta. Blues wouldn't vanish into corporate graves. "That boy understood legacy ain't about lists." Luther's words trembled across the page. "It's about keeping the flame alive for those who come next." The editors gathered around that single letter, passing it between trembling hands. Here was proof beyond technique or sales. Page had protected music's sacred lineage when nobody was watching, when there was nothing to gain except preservation of truth. His revolution wasn't just sonic innovation, but spiritual guardianship, honoring roots while exploding futures. By sunset, the editorial board called an emergency meeting. Some omissions, they finally understood, weren't mistakes but crimes against history itself. The conference room fell silent as Jimmy Page entered, carrying a leather satchel worn soft by decades of travel. He moved with quiet dignity, placing the bag on the mahogany table as editors leaned forward, their skepticism melting into curiosity. From within, he extracted a notebook so weathered its spine had split into fabric threads, pages yellowed like autumn leaves. "This," he said softly, "is where the future was written, before anyone knew to listen." His fingers opened the book to reveal hand-drawn diagrams of alternate tunings, mathematical equations calculating harmonic resonance, sketches of modified amplifier circuits that wouldn't exist commercially for another 20 years. The chief editor gasped, recognizing techniques every modern guitarist now considered standard, all documented in Page's precise handwriting from 1968. Here was archaeological proof of revolution, innovation captured in fading ink before the world had vocabulary to describe it. Page turned pages like unveiling sacred texts, showing chord progressions that defied musical theory, studio layering techniques that producers would later claim as their own discoveries. "I never needed credit," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of earned wisdom rather than bitterness. "Music isn't about being first in someone's magazine, it's about opening doors so others can walk through and build something greater." The silence that followed held reverence reserved for temples. These weren't just notes, but blueprints of transformation, evidence that true genius doesn't announce itself with press releases, but whispers through generations, teaching hands not yet born how to make guitars speak in languages nobody knew existed. The editorial board gathered 72 hours after that transformative meeting, their faces bearing the gravity of those rewriting history. The editor-in-chief stood before colleagues and legal advisors, her voice steady but laden with emotion as she announced what no major publication had done in 5 decades. They would retract, apologize, and reimagine their entire framework. "We didn't just miss a name," she declared, fingers trembling against the podium. "We failed to understand that some artists transcend measurement itself." The revised list arrived on newsstands with a cover unlike anything Rolling Stone had published. A single image of Page's Weathered hands on guitar strings, above text reading, beyond ranking, the architects who built the foundation. Inside, a full-page apology acknowledged their failure to recognize innovation that predated recognition, influence that couldn't be quantified by polls or popularity. They created a new tier, reserved exclusively for those who didn't just play music, but fundamentally altered its DNA, its molecular structure, its very possibility. Page's placement in this unprecedented category came with 16 pages of testimony from musicians across generations, each describing specific moments when his techniques unlocked doors in their own creativity. The magazine reproduced pages from his notebook alongside modern studio technology, showing how his 68 innovations predicted the future with supernatural accuracy. Readers witnessed archaeology and prophecy merged into one undeniable truth. The issue sold out within hours, but its impact rippled deeper than sales figures. It forced the industry to reconsider how genius gets measured, remembered, honored. Page had transformed even his exclusion into revolution. The conference room blazed with camera flashes as Page entered, moving with that familiar quietness that always made loudness seem irrelevant. He declined the prepared podium, instead sitting on a simple stool with his acoustic guitar resting against his knee, insisting the Tokyo guitarist, now flown halfway across the world, sit beside him. "This moment belongs to Kenji," Page said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. He reminded us that music isn't owned by magazines or institutions. It lives in the hands of anyone brave enough to defend it. Kenji's eyes glistened as Page placed one weathered hand on his shoulder, telling the assembled press how a 23-year-old stranger had accomplished what awards never could, proving that legacy isn't granted by committees but earned through transformation that echoes across generations. Page spoke of the thousands who joined the protest, musicians from Lagos to Lima, each adding their voice to something larger than vindication. "They weren't fighting for my reputation," he explained, fingers absently tracing his guitar's curves. "They were protecting the idea that innovation matters more than popularity." Then Page did something unexpected. He asked Kenji to play. The young guitarist's hands trembled as he lifted the offered instrument, but when his fingers found the strings, the room fell absolutely silent. Page watched with visible pride as those notes soared upward, each one carrying the spirit of defiance that had changed everything. "This," Page whispered to the cameras, "is what greatness actually sounds like. Courage meeting craft, regardless of recognition." The two guitarists embraced as the room erupted, but Page's expression remained serene, untouched by validation, forever dwelling in that space where true artists live, beyond the reach of lists, beyond the need for crowns. The truth emerged 3 weeks later through a music journalist's investigation. Page had received an advance copy of the list, his publicist confirming the call that never came, the ranking that excluded his name. He'd sat in his Thameside home, the magazine's email glowing on his screen, and made a choice that defined 5 decades of artistry. He told no one, called no lawyers, issued no statements. Instead, he'd gone to his studio and played for hours, letting the music answer what words could not, trusting that real legacy doesn't crumble under institutional oversight. The notebook he'd shown Rolling Stone's editors contained innovations dating back to his session days, techniques guitarists worldwide now considered fundamental, all documented in his precise handwriting before most rock anthems existed. But Page had never published them, never claimed ownership, allowing the language of guitar to evolve organically as countless musicians discovered what he'd quietly pioneered. His silence wasn't weakness, but profound understanding. Revolutionary art doesn't require credit because it becomes invisible, woven so deeply into culture's fabric that separation becomes impossible. Kenji later found a handwritten note slipped into his guitar case, Page's words, simple and devastating. You gave voice when I chose silence. Both are necessary. Both are powerful. Never stop playing truth. The young guitarist framed those words above his teaching studio in Tokyo, where students learned that mastery means serving music rather than demanding music serve you. Page's lesson echoed through generations. Dignity isn't maintaining your position on lists, but transcending the need for them entirely. The greatest guitarists don't chase immortality because their fingers already wrote it into every song you've ever loved, without knowing why. What legacy are you building that doesn't need recognition to matter? Subscribe to discover more stories where quiet revolution changes everything.